Okay, you're live.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special meeting of the Mahone Bay Town Council. This is the second meeting in our series on the 2021-2022 budget. Glad to see that everyone is with us here tonight, and also to you folks at home who may be watching on YouTube. There will be an in-camera session when this discussion is completed. When we get to the end of this discussion, as is typically the case in any council meeting, we will ask if there are any questions from those watching from home on any issue that is discussed this evening. You have an agenda, council, that was emailed to you. Entertain a motion to approve the agenda or amend it. Councillor Burdick, move to accept, to approve, and Councillor Carver, seconded. Moved and seconded to approve the agenda as presented. Deputy Mayor, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question or a suggestion. One of the things we did was to introduce a land acknowledgement, and we've not been putting that on the agenda, and I was thinking that we need to do that so that you can remind us to make the acknowledgement.
You are quite right in that observation. I had been holding that for a regular council meeting, but there's no reason why we can't do that acknowledgement for a special meeting. And so I will begin with our deep thanks to the Mi'kmaq people. We are gathered today in the traditional land of Mi'kma'ki, and we are grateful for that. Thank you, Deputy Mayor, for that. You heard the motion. All in favor? The motion is carried. The agenda is accepted. Item number 2 on the agenda, discussion of the draft 2021-2022, should it not? Operating capital budget, I think.
It
It's
should,
showing
yes,
as
there's a typo.
2021.
I think we did that a couple of times and we've been correcting them as we go.
Okay.
It's a
So-
new year. It's like when it turns over on the calendar, you know. It's hard to
GAO, crank it up, go forward 12 months, and let's talk about the draft of the 2021-2022 operating and capital budgets. I know there's been a lot of commentary on it. Over to you, CAO.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So yeah, on Monday we had the opportunity to have the presentation of the draft budget documents from Manager of Finance Luke Wenzel. If anybody's watching now who didn't watch on Monday, I'd suggest you go back and watch that one, and you can cut right into this one and hear the discussion. And then the primary purpose of this session is for discussion. As the mayor says, a number of council members have had some thoughts on the draft budget. Typically what we do at this type of session, the first discussion session, second budget session, is look for amendments to the draft that was presented. So basically, you typically, and I know that in a regular meeting of council, it would often be the case that a motion would be made and then there'd be discussion on the motion. Typically, there is some discussion with the mayor chairing, and councilors have the opportunity to give some thoughts. And then motions can be put on the floor to amend the draft document. So we do usually do it by motion if it's to remove an item. It is essentially just shows how that happens. If it's how things are stated in the document, if it's a note or, Luke just trying to provide some clarification, Luke could offer that is something that he'll just do. But otherwise, we do usually get some motions at this session, or at the next one, depending on council's preference, and then take a little time to send out a new version with changes and have some discussion on that. Understanding this is the first process for a number of members here, we may want to have some specific items that we sort of flag for significant discussion at a next meeting before having another draft of the, significantly altered draft of the budget presented. But yeah, I would encourage Mr. Mayor, you want to get some general feedback from everyone before we start finding out where maybe there's some consensus around changes that might need to be made.
I would prefer to do the general discussion with members of council, if that's okay, and find out what concerns are that may exist before we look at things that we would remove and or add specifically to the budget.
So do you want to call on folks to? I was just thinking everybody would have an opportunity to provide some initial commentary. I don't know if that's.
Let's see if there are any members of council who would like to address some specific issues, and we'll go from there. I'm sure it will engender some discussion. Councillor Carver.
So I had sent a question into Mr. Wenzel earlier today about the very early statement, the budget summary, and asking why the changes were stated as budget to budget rather than actual to budget. I was just, it seemed to me intuitively that we would be basing this year's budget on what was actually spent last year. And Mr. Wenzel's response suggested that this was at the discretion of council to decide which would be the preferred manner. So I'd be interested to hear what the pros and cons are of doing it one way versus the other.
Okay. Mr. Finance CAO.
Oh, I just, I guess in terms of the pros and cons, if that's presumably a request for some commentary on it, one of the concerns about using the actuals for last year compared to budget this year is for where operating initiatives would normally distort the budget. So if there's a major initiative that didn't take place in the prior year, and then it is happening in this year, the budget to budget number stays virtually identical because the thing was moved forward, but the actual to budget number appears to show a significant increase, but the increase is just the carry forward of the existing project. So, we'll show a number of items that were under budget because projects didn't happen. If those projects are going to move forward this year, they will appear to show as an increase actual to budget. That's just one example where, budget to budget better reflects a year in which a number of initiatives didn't happen and that many of them are still carried forward.
Okay. And would we be discussing the reasons why they did not happen last year and attempt to forecast whether a similar rationale might occur in the coming fiscal year to delay it yet again, or?
We can certainly go through any of the specific. I think any of the items that are midway through projects now rather than haven't moved along at all. There were a couple of capital items that hadn't moved along at all we could talk about for sure. But in terms of the operating initiatives, they're generally things that are now underway that had been put entirely in last year's budget.
Okay.
The accessibility operational plan is one that we had anticipated being underway last year. It hasn't gotten underway at all. But COVID the province did extend that process by a year. So essentially all the timelines for adoption were pushed back on that end.
Yeah, okay. Councillor Wilson.
Not entirely sure how to phrase this, but I think in the context of what we're budgeting for this year is an annual increase in revenue of about 15%, not 15 some odd percent, in a 1.5% inflationary environment. And we have a situation, if I'm reading this correctly, where we went from a budgeted excess revenue over expenditures in 2021 of $224,000 to a budgeted excess of $648,000 this year. So that roughly the $425,000 increase. I'm wondering what the appetite for council would be to suggest very strongly to the CAO and his staff that our goal should be a 0 rate increase in our taxation this year and work from there.
Thank you. CAO?
Oh, I wanted to point out that the increases that we're looking at are on revenue streams traditionally devoted to capital spending and capital reserves. So that's where we have big increases in revenue, not a big increases in operating expenditures. The non-operating expenditures, capital reserve items, those are where those monies are going. So the easy solution, if what's being requested is to divert funding that would normally go to capital expenditures and capital reserves over to operating, that's where it's going. So, you know, the increases that are being recommended are to preserve those dedicated capital funding streams. You know, we have that discretion on some of those capital funding streams if council wants to explore that. But it has been an effort in the past and always in our budget preparation to preserve those dedicated capital funding streams.
So perhaps, Mr. Mayor, if you could ask, if I could ask for a little bit more clarity on the composition of that $425,000 extra surplus compared to last year.
Luke, do you want to take that? And you can maybe share the screen if you want to.
I can just probably verbalize it unless anybody wants to see the screen. I'll just look at my budget document here quick. So I know one big part is the area dividend this year, which has gone up by around $200,000 as a result of the construction dividend for the solar garden project, assuming that goes forward. And we've also got another $85,000, which is the gas tax funds, which are expected to be double this year as compared to last year. So that they almost make up approximately $300,000 of the increase just with those two items alone.
Councillor Feeney, and then Deputy Mayor.
So, Mayor, just to ask for a little clarity. So I think what Councillor Wilson was getting at is the proposed tax rate increase that is material, and depending on how you slice and dice the combination between the direct property tax rate and the increase in the fire rate is, you know, about 5.75% increase. Said another way, it's 7.2 cents in tax rate, which is 100% funding operating expenses. I don't think Councilor Wilson was asking any questions about the capital funding, which is coming from area dividend, the gas tax, the infrastructure fund, and deed transfer tax, all of which were materially favorable last year and this year, which is supporting a huge capital investment that we're all willing to make. I think where the crux of the matter is around the operating side, where we have very substantial ongoing operating expense increases year after year, and we're now asking for like a big tax increase that I wonder if there's any appetite to accept, especially since we're in this very unique time where COVID is impacting the community so intensely. So, I mean, that's just some starting commentary, but I don't think this has anything to do with preserving revenue streams, direct 100% dedicated to capital. To be frank, council has little impact on that now. The gas tax is coming from the Prime Minister, and the deed transfer tax are coming from the raw community. We wait with bated breath for the area dividend at whatever that number is, and I think we're already almost at the max based on last year's commentary around the infrastructure charges. But fortunately, all those sources are providing us with a lot more revenue than we would have thought of a couple years ago.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor and then CAO.
I thought the CEO wanted to respond to that. But
I thought you were hoping to get your comment in first, Deputy Mayor.
Okay. One of the things that in my mind as a first time, I guess, peruse of the budget, I've struggled with is the question around, doesn't a budget come with a budget narrative? So one of the questions that's come up is we're dealing with a budget increase. So to a I guess a community member who's looking at the budget will not really infer that. They would have to really, I guess, find some intuition to get that. So I would appreciate in the future if we clearly lay that out and have a budget narrative to that. The second question for me is in trying to understand basically the tax increase we are asking for. We are hoping to raise a particular amount of money. Now, in doing my math, it all seems to be in the range of 130-some thousand. I could be wrong because I'm also struggling to understand the budget as a whole, and just trying to clarify whether that's the case. And with that in mind, I'm wondering, are there places, because I am with the Councillor Wilson and Feeney around, I think we need to not increase the rates right now and figure out other ways in which we can maybe rein in our expenses, at least for now. In some of the commentary, we mentioned that when the fire hall, I guess, costs come into play, we might even start thinking about another increase. So I don't think that would be very, very fair to the residents to be every year we'll be contemplating I guess a substantial increase. So I would maybe like a little bit more clarity on that if I have the math right, and also for us all to consider maybe looking at other ways to meet the costs we have. That makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. CAO?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I'm going to go back to Joe, Councillor Feeney. You asked why I spoke to the 14% increase in revenue coming from capital streams. That was to address Councillor Wilson's question, where is this 14% increase in revenue coming from? So I wouldn't have brought the capital into it, but that was why I was speaking to that point.
So thanks, Dylan, for the clarity.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, you look at it, you see this big increase in revenues, not a big increase in expenditures, what's going on there. But there is a part, as you note, that is nothing to do with capital, which is that approximately 5%, a little bit over 5%, that's a recommended tax increase. And I just wanted to kind of call back, and I think this speaks to Deputy Mayor's final comment as well, to last year's budget process. Obviously, we did, right after COVID pandemic began, a lot of uncertainty about how it's going to affect the community, and council took a number of steps, including deferring our budget increase. So we had a part, and it is expressed in these documents, about half of that 5% was last year's deferred increase. And at the time, council had decided it was not appropriate to do an increase. And what we did, we didn't go back and just make a rosier projection. We tightened our belts through the year. What we did in the budget was we put it down as a transfer from operating reserve. And as you all know, we didn't need that transfer from operating reserve. We did tighten our belts through the year. So Luke and I maybe take some exception to tightening our belts in a budget, which at the end of the day is meant to present a realistic scenario. Better to show a transfer from operating reserve that we can afford, and then tighten our belts through the year, which we have done, which we did do last year. So I want to put out there as an example to council, how do you get to that point of a zero tax increase or a minimal reasonable tax increase? Do you do it by making the numbers look better, or do you do it by putting in a transfer from operating reserve and then in practice working to actually make those numbers in the actual column, which we did do last year, come in lower? So that's just the kind of what is the budget kind of discussion, but I think it's an important one for us to have in terms of what we're trying to do here, and then how that actually plays out through the year. We don't go out and spend everything in the budget. I know some people's perception of other levels of government is if you got the number on the page, you're going to try to spend it. We're going to try not to spend it in most cases if we can deliver that same service. And then I just wanted to speak to the comment about the narrative of the budget, because I think that's a good point, especially with first time around. Typically what we've done, and Luke I think spoke to this quite a bit in his presentation on Monday, staff are presenting scenarios and recommendations to council. The narrative of the budget is typically crafted after that next provision that I spoke about. So there's a part in the budget document on our website from last year, it's about 2 pages at the beginning, that essentially tells the story of what council's trying to achieve with the budget and highlights some of the key points. And that is something that we would add once council has essentially determined through this process, what is the narrative? Is the narrative that we're holding the rate because of COVID? Is the narrative that these tax increases represent real cost increases that Luke has mentioned, such as our insurance going up $20,000? Those things we don't have any control over. Those are happening. So the narrative that council builds around that really comes from this part in the process. So if somebody is jumping in at this point, there isn't that much of a narrative, but it's not really staff's place to create that narrative before council has had the opportunity to work on the budget. So that's how we typically have done that in the past.
Okay. Thank you. Councillor Feeney.
Mayor, I think like the budget has enjoyed, or the community's enjoyed a lot of growth, assessment-based growth in the last 2 years. I think Luke has a really elegant table at the beginning of the deck that talks about the increased assessment, but where the drivers are coming from. And I think if you wouldn't want to steal your thunder, Luke, but I think it's a similar metric and a similar trend the year before as well. So I'm going by memory here, but I'd say, what's the overall assessment, Luke? I think 130 residential, something like that, 130 million?
126.
126
range,
million.
yeah.
So 126 million, but 7 million of that 126 has come from growth of either brand new construction and or turnover of real estate in the last 24 months. Like that is, that's like 10 years, that's like 10 years worth of growth in the rearview mirror. So we've had immense growth of our organic tax base recently. So our budget and we're able to fund these cost increases because we've got more people paying, either through higher assessment rates or there's just physically more homes because there've been all this new construction here in the last 2 years. But the question is, like, how long can that last? For at least that's a question I have. Like, we're going to get a big jump next year with the new senior citizens home, other construction, more single housing being developed, which would put your mind at ease. But if you're living on Pleasant Street and you haven't moved and you haven't just moved here, and your house has gone up by 1 or 2% of assessed value, like a 6% increase in rate is tough. And I think we all are really familiar with the fire rates and the rationale for why the fire rates have to go higher. I think Luke's detail is really, really on point. It just showed, like, you have to finance the fire hall, got to buy some uniforms. We've got more power to run the new fire hall. I mean, it's just math. So you can really rationalize the 3 cents on power on the fire rate if it's just Mahone Bay paying the entire freight for those new costs, because we don't think we can pass any of these costs on to our partners in Maiders Cove, Indian Point, Oakland, and Clearland, which is a conversation we may want to have in camera to talk a little more about that. But it's really beyond that. It's the 4 cents on direct operating expenses is, I think, to Dylan's point, where we just need to come together over the next couple meetings to get us all aligned.
Okay, thank you.
Not much we can do on the fire rate, given the math. Right, Luke? I mean, you can speak to this better than I can, but it's just math, right?
I mean, there's a couple places where you could try trim it up a little bit, but not a huge amount. It's a pretty static set budget for the most part.
We have the ability to trim the current year increase. Would essentially the current year increase, if it is overestimated, just softens the impact of the coming increase next year, because we're still in this capital period where we know and council knows that we've committed to a number of increases as a result of the new building and the fire truck purchase that's coming. So, this increase, if we've overestimated the need for it, and it is true that we've presumed certain things around janitorial and some of the expenses associated with the new building, and maybe those are a little bit high, but worst case scenario, if they are, next year's rate increase will be that much lower. So, at the end of the day, that money is dedicated to the fire service. The fire service needs the money, and it is easier for people to have a more predictable year-over-year increase.
You know, I think in our earlier discussions, Mayor, where we chatted about the benefits and the obligations of the new fire department and the building, you know, I think we have a multi-year plan for funding, both from the citizens of the community, but also from our other notional customers. But right now, Luke, just so everybody's on the same page, we're at 13.5 cents today in Mahone Bay, but that's based on us also having the benefit of hydrants.
Correct.
You strip the hydrants out, we're at 11 cents. And that's what our partners pay as well. So we're all even Steven. So but the increase is just going to come to Mahone Bay. We're not sharing that increase for the time, at least in this budget, with Maiders Cove, Indian Point, Oakland, and Clearland. I think that's right, Luke?
Yeah, I mean, that's how the current budget stands. I mean, as we go down the road and the full cost of the new fire station comes on, we purchase a new fire truck, then the discussions will have to be had at that point as to how we move forward in financing that.
So I mean, from my perspective, for what it's worth, this is just one opinion. That would put I think like this is an apple we've taken half a bite out of already. I think we have limited flexibility, and I personally, I'd be prepared to support the 135 on the fire rate. And I think it's a compelling and reasonable conversation to have with our neighbors in these other communities about the benefits of the new fire hall, the impact on the insurance rates, the fact that the service coverage is going to be well taken care of, the investment in the fire service, and why we all need to get together going forward so that the citizens of Mahone Bay aren't paying $118 in 2 years. But, you know, so I think this is step one in a multi-phased, multi-year process to fund the overall investment.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Burdick.
I agree with Councillor Feeney that it's really worth having a discussion about the fire rate and how maybe in camera, as mentioned, talking it over with other people who do get that service. Aside from that, or in addition to that, I do worry about deferring other increases and, you know, another year because of the impact the next year. There is a thing that I see happening in, you know, various governmental levels where it looks really good to have low, very low taxes and then grab it from other places along the way. I think it's more realistic to have it be in place within reason at the outset, and then have it be a little less dramatic as the years go on, because that could be a very painful thing next year that we deal with, unless we again are finding other ways of deferring it.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Mayor Kangata.
So I appreciate Alice's concerns there about deferring it. My I guess notion about the deferment is that my assumption is that one of the things we're going to do, if we're going really to aggressively pursue our strategic plan, is that we will grow this town. And we're growing this town, hopefully that will mean we'll be growing the things that can generate income. So Joe talked about more buildings, the nursing home coming online. And if we're talking about starting to put together our housing strategy, getting an aggressive, I guess, growth strategy for the town, which will mean hopefully more revenue. And so I know that taxing is one way we generate that, but we can either increase the tax rate or increase the sources of the taxes. So I would prefer to increase the sources rather than the taxes, because I know there are some people who this will impact much more than others. And that's where I'm coming at it from.
Thank you. Councillor Now.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. I think we should try to keep, if we do have to have any increase this year, I think we should try to keep it to a minimum. As far as deferring goes, I think there are some projects on the go within the town boundaries that I think are going to increase our assessment, that they will help ease any extra tax burden that we might see next year. So it's not going to be as drastic next year if we get if these other projects come through and we can increase our assessment by that much, then but I think we have to really look at this budget and try to keep our increases this year to a minimum.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Carver? You're on mute, Councillor.
I certainly support the idea of keeping taxes as low as the increase as low as possible, but we're operating on predictions for the future. We don't know. We don't have control, and I just have two little scenarios. One is that in one of my terms on council, when we deliberately did not include a tax increase, we were very sorry for that the next year because we had to increase it considerably the following year. And then the other scenario is more recent and was reported in the press recently in a neighboring community where the budget included a considerable tax increase, and one of the councillors' comments was that reflected the fact that they hadn't done increases over the past few years. So it resulted in quite a big tax increase. So that's just sort of a little bit of devil's advocate, the other side. And we know that there's going to be a big hit coming down when the fire hall payments start coming on. And so that, I think we have to find the tightrope there that will get us across.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Feeney, from a PVSC perspective, what's the outlook around our commercial revenues in the future, given the impacts of COVID, I'm thinking in particular?
Well, I'm happy to provide a little commentary there, Mayor. I do think Councillor Burrick had a quick question, but I'm happy to speak to that. I'm not sure if you saw her.
I did not see her.
Okay, no. Fair enough. So I think that so across the province we have like 800,000 or 900,000 homes, dwellings, and we did 14,500 real estate transactions last year, which by themselves is not a high statistical sample. So I think there's going to be a reticence to assume that the euphoria around real estate prices that have occurred over the last 6 months is indicative of long-term trend until you have enough of a statistical base to actually declare that. So my sense, and of course you see it, I think this is the 4th year in a row since I've been on council that we've had the commercial assessment decline in Mahone Bay. And it's quite low on a relative percentage basis of where the revenue streams are coming from. And I bet you if we look back in time, I mean, it's really inverted. And I think we talked about that when we were having our Saturday afternoon session with the strategic plan. Like our reliance on the commercial base is dramatically lower than it was a decade ago when you and Councillor Carver were on council. So, I think that there's lots of reasons to believe that in due course, the valuations are going to be reflected, whether it's by the parabolic increase in lumber prices, whether it's the cost of an electrician. Like these inflationary drivers are going to drive real estate prices higher, and I think where the PVSC is speaking plainly for that organization is like they're not an organization that sets tax rates. That's our problem. But I think I don't think you're going to see a Lunenburg this year at a 5.5% increase in assessment base. I think Luke, ours is 2, give or take. I can't see Luke on the screen anymore, but I think ours is 2, for example. Thank God, thank goodness.
You're correct.
Theirs is 5.5. So can you imagine that conversation around that table? Thank goodness we've had all that growth. It's really saving our bacon.
Thank you. Councillor Burdick, somebody told me you had your hand up, so.
Yes, yes, I did. That's fine. Thank you. I do think, and it was brought up actually by Councillor Feeney in an email about, and I think reiterated by Councillor Carver, but and possibly Wilson, about the possibility of not rushing this process through the beginning of May, and then letting this conversation happen as it needs to. I do know that, I mean, part of a budget is speculation, but it's using things that have, you're using markers that have happened before. We've had a really remarkable year, we'll say, past year. It's been terrible for a lot of people. I mean, the housing boom, which has benefited a lot of people, has also been really bad for other people. And generally, historically, when there's a boom of any sort, it can maintain, it can keep going, but then there's usually a dramatic, not so great thing that happens afterwards, at least for part of the population. So I do think that we have to be really balanced in terms of our approach in the coming years. There are things in here which give me a lot of hope. I mean, the fact that we're getting the water lines starting to address it, that I'm hoping that then affects, the water cost, which is so high comparatively, and then maybe ultimately in the following years, we'll be able to have that reflected positively in the budget, right? So I'm an advocate for the later May date in terms of getting the budget through, unless we're all in agreement. And I have a feeling that it'll be not a quick process. So just putting that out there, we're doing that discussion right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Feeney.
Mayor, sorry, I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
No?
I think Councillor Carver made a good point last week about, I don't think councillors want to micromanage the line items of the budget. I don't think anybody has a desire to staff is eminently qualified to review all the line items. But I do think this evening, so over the next, hour, as we have multiple topics to talk about, I do think we can provide some direction to staff to try to get us on track. One, reading the tea leaves, I don't think the existing proposed rate increase of 1.15, I think we want to do better. Reading the tea leaves. I don't know if aspirationally, if we can get all the way to a flat rate, maybe we can't, but I do think council should provide staff with some direction and come back with their best ideas of where some economies and belt tightening can occur. And based on Luke's detailed information, where 1 cent is equal to $15,000, I think maybe we start with something more realistic. Like, I think 0 increase is $70,000 or $80,000 if I'm reading the math right. So I think we could give some direction tonight about a second version, and just to get out sharpen up the pencil, as they say, and try to get us closer to something that we can support. And I also, and I really don't know if we have much flexibility on the fire rate based on the simple math that we have. It's just linear math, and I think this is really great that we have the conversations where we have split out the fire rate from the direct rate for the first time in the budget. This is the first time citizens won't have seen that before, so we'll need a communication package to explain that. But I think this is really, really helpful on that front. But So what I think what I'd like to do is what I'd like to see is some direction back to staff this evening to, you know, to try to get a little closer to something that we could actually vote on and get over the goal line. And then I also think there's a lot of, and that would really deal in large part with the town's direct operating budget. I do think there's a number of other questions around the electrical utility we might want to get to, either this evening or sometime in the next week and a half or so, to really be able to talk about that, which I think is a separate, distinct issue from the property tax rate.
Okay. Mr. Wilson, Councillor Wilson, sorry.
That's fine. I was kind of hoping that we would come to a point where we were thinking about the philosophy of the policy that we should have in place around creating a budget. Wherever I was when I was involved with budgets, I was always told what my income was going to be from the get-go, and that the increase usually would be zero. Sometimes I was required to do less than zero. And you go and figure out how to run your department or your company or whatever it is based on that top line number. And we do it the other way around. We add up all the things we have to spend money on and then do the math to figure out how much the tax rate has to be to pay for it all. And in my opinion, that's backwards.
Mm-hmm. So you're suggesting more focus on the necessity of what we're including?
Well, of course, I have a bias, but my philosophy would be to say that the town of Mahone Bay will operate its fiscal house with zero rate increases, and we will live off increases that are made available from assessment increases and other sources of income, full stop. And when you have to deviate from that, it requires some real head scratching. But that's just my philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Good points, Deputy Mayor.
I just say I agree with that philosophy. I think it's would be prudent living for council.
Thank you, CAO.
I feel it's necessary for staff to provide a counterpoint to this philosophy. It certainly goes against everything that we're trained in, all of our experience in the public sector. And I mean, what it really comes down to is what the mandate of a private sector company is, which is to extract profit and externalize cost. So where you can cut corners, typically the government picks up those costs. Private sector companies, that's what they do. They cut corners, they find opportunities. The town has done that. I think we're in some ways paying the price for cutting corners over the years. And with transition, with Luke and I coming in, with a lot of staff looking at things, there have been necessary increases in cost. And some of those increases in cost represent doing the job right. It's unfortunate. It's unfortunate to have to do that. But you know, we are making strides to improve safety, to improve the quality of the services delivered, to do that legally. So there are, I'm not saying there's no areas to tighten our belts, but some of the the ethos that is being described, you know, it works for a private company whose stakeholders are their bottom line, but it may not be appropriate for a government who has to live with its residents and year over year come back to those same rates. We can't go get a whole bunch of new residents when these residents don't like our past practices. So it's just not apples to apples when you're talking about a private company and a government.
Okay. Councillor Feeney?
So, you know, I think so much of our budget just flows through our bank account and comes in one door and goes out the other. So you think about the money we send to the housing, policing, education, like those are big numbers, and they come, but then they go away really quickly. So we're collecting so much of this revenue on other people's behalves. And of course, all of those line items come with automatic increases. And Luke, I think we're also providing our our obligations to staff for salary increases based on based on CPI this year. Say
Correct. I think it was 0.7%.
0.7. So, and I think Mayor, that's 0.7 compared to 1.3 at Joint Services Board, right? Which was the number we talked about last week. So as we all know, so I think that is interesting. That's good, Luke, because there's like 6 different CPI rates, as you know, and I think you've chosen a fair one that the council would be that's a very respectful choice, because there are a number of organizations that I'm involved with, and they have a wide range, and they tend to take the highest range. So I tip my hat to you for that decision, and for Dylan. I think that's a considerate and thoughtful perspective on that front. But at the end of the day, I think really we're just playing around the edges. We're probably $50,000 in operating expense away from getting the rate increase reduced to something the council would be more inclined to support, based on my math. I mean, this is hardly heavy lifting on a multi-million-dollar budget. And while I'm prepared to sit here tonight till midnight and go through it line by line, I do think, out of respect to Luke and Dylan, it might be more prudent for us to give them a second kick at the can, and then maybe council can give some direction on some specific things that we may be willing to defer. Not saying we're never going to do them. We're just saying we're not going to do them today. And I think I have a number of things that I think we could probably push that while we wait. I think the other thing, and then I promise I'll pass the baton back to you. In the last few years, I guess since really 2018, I've observed that we put a lot of line items in the budget based on the other levels of government inevitably funding a portion of them, and we wait patiently. And we have a few of those kinds of items this year too, specifically around the water work that Councilor Burdick spoke of. I think we have millions of dollars of applications out to those levels of government that we're still waiting to hear from. So my thinking is, like, I don't know if we put in a proposal sometime later on this year if we're going to actually spend any money this year. My guess is there's zero chance of that happening. So I wonder if we might take a more aggressive approach to timeline the year a little more aggressively, to say, if we put in our submission for 50% co-share on the water study, for example, realistically, are we going to get that money in year and spend that money in year? Like, I doubt it. So how do we pass that tax rate, that impact of that cost onto the taxpayer today, when really, I mean, maybe it'll show up. We're still waiting for our response to 2018 and 19 submissions, or 19 and 20, pardon me, submissions. Anyway, just a few thoughts.
Thank you. CAO, would you respond?
I certainly can. I want to leave more opportunity for people, but I know Councillor Feeney has given me a few things I could certainly respond to. So to the idea that Luke and I can go back and tighten things up, like I said, I mean, there's 2 basic principles to that, and we can look for places where we could come in lower than what we've budgeted. I think based on last year's actuals and the current unfortunate situation with the pandemic, we know there are some numbers there that won't materialize. So we reduced expenses, for example, but by nowhere near as much as they actually fell last year. But there's an understanding as well that with year-to-year costs, if we make something look better in one year, it doesn't actually remove it from the following year. So unless we actually think that after the pandemic it won't go back, it's better to leave it relatively where it was, have a better than anticipated year, and not transfer money from the operating reserve that we would put in the budget to cover the deferred rate. And that's exactly what happened last year. Last year we deferred a rate. We didn't actually draw on the operating reserve to cover for that deferred rate. We didn't need to do that. So, I don't mind either way, whatever we're directed to do, but I think that it is less of a distortion to show an operating reserve transfer and just leave the expenses and defer the rate that way, than to just tighten all those numbers up so that that $50,000 disappears. To Joe's point, that $50,000 disappears, and then it's just back next year under normal circumstances. So that's really why we don't normally do that. But either way, you know, at council's discretion, what you're trying to achieve, understandably, is a lesser rate increase this year, and that's what you would achieve by either of those means. And certainly, staff can work on the draft to do that. And I just wanted to speak to the idea of deferring specific projects, especially, you know, the big capital projects, for example. There are some occasions, I think, as Luke's quite, you know, nuanced in how he does this, where the wastewater side of a water project moving forward at a different time means a debenture at a different time, and debenture payments kick in at a different time. And so, you know, it may be that if we move a project on the capital side, that it would actually come back to have some impact in this budget in the current year. But the main reason that we show those projects as, you know, ready to move forward in the current year is because when we do have an opportunity, and I know it seems crazy, but this is why we have always done it, is but when we do have an opportunity to get those projects funded, it's important that we show our seriousness with moving forward with them immediately. And, you know, to Councillor Feeney's point, we're waiting on things from 2018, but in 2018, we were told that we needed to be ready to implement those things in 2018. And as you know, we do continue to have just enough contact with higher levels of government around those programs to give us reason to believe that they are coming. And every time, you know, just around the corner.
Always just around the corner. Okay. Councillor Carver.
I'm going to venture into the field of heresy right now. So I just want to raise. I'm looking at the sheet about the special projects and strategic initiatives, and so I'm just wondering, do we need to spend $30,000 on housing strategy development? And I'm asking because I seriously am not convinced that that's going to give us value for money. I believe that we need to understand our housing situation, but I'm not sure that this is the way to go about it, and this may not be the right time to go about it. So I'm just throwing that out for discussion. And then the other one that I had questions about was, this wasn't my idea, I think it was Councillor Feeney who asked the question about the $60,000 for the water system diagnosis, and whether that was going to be value for money. Or maybe it was Councillor Wilson who asked that question. Anyway, it was asked. So I'm just putting those two questions out for feedback about whether we really want to do those or need to do those this year.
Thank you. Deputy Mayor Congado, and then Councillor Burdick.
You really did go into heresy. Councillor Carver. At some point, I was sort of wondering if you're part of Shark. So my Shark heart came on as you were talking about housing. I mean, I think the way I interpret that is that staff are holding. They've heard what council has intention about housing, and they are holding some funds so that that particular arm of the strategy is able to move along. It's not just for a strategy development. That's the way I interpret it, and I think we probably might need elements in there. The other day there was you raised I think it was either you or Councillor Bardick who raised the issue of a needs assessment that might require us to partner with the rest of the municipalities. I think without the funding there, then those kinds of things would not happen. So I think on that housing piece, I would love if we kept it on and did not affect that.
Thank you, Councillor Burdick.
Yes, I think you know what I'm going to say too. Yeah, I brought up the needs assessment at the last meeting, and I think because it is such a big part of what we've all agreed that we do want to happen in town, that it is important to have it explicit somewhere in the budget that this is going to be used in some way for that purpose. So I guess whether it's a good use of the money or not depends on how we use the money. And at this point, it's set aside. It's not explicitly defined, but we can explicitly define it. I think without the money there, it just is not going to happen, unfortunately, because it's easy for other things to supplant it, and it can just remain, you know, the hope that the private sector take that over, and which they will, and we will be working with them in many ways also, but we need to have that intent on our side, I think. So I'd hold on to that one.
Just as a thought, when you mentioned the private sector, of course, we do have a couple of projects in the offing that have a considerable amount of housing that's affordable included in the mix. Would it be reasonable to defer the study to the next fiscal year and consider what the impact of the new housing activity is going to be? CAO?
I wanted to speak to the notion of the operating reserve funded initiative. So this, we've been talking about a $50,000 shortfall in overall budget. That speaks to things that are year-over-year costs. But then when we're talking about these, say $25,000 for housing, which, again, that's drawing on the operating reserve. So the reason that we put those operating initiatives in here really is to give council an understanding of what the balance of the operating reserve is and what will be there for unanticipated expenses. So if we do everything we anticipate, according to council's strategic plan, we know what the balance is going to be. It doesn't actually necessarily mean that we do everything or that it costs that. And as to Councillor Burdick's point, we do need to define better what it is. And we haven't had time. I mean, the strategic planning process was just happening. Staff need to put a number there. But based on reviewing other similar work that's been done elsewhere in the province, we have a pretty good understanding that that's the impact on our operating reserve that could happen at, a reasonable estimate of what could happen. And we can tell that based on the rest of our budget, the operating reserve can actually accommodate that. And the council, in having its strategic plan, isn't making any commitments or promises that we're not in a position to afford. So it really speaks more to the maintenance of the reserve. And whether we actually do it this year, we've had some good conversations lately. I know some at committee and some at the mayor's wardens, not everybody was a part of, around the timing of the next census and how that relates to the housing needs assessment and, whether that would be this year or next year. But there was also a good discussion where the town of Bridgewater is doing data collection this year and quite in community data collection to supplement stuff that would come from a census. And, we have some opportunity to do that and to also look at how that data collection might overlap with other data collection with our greenhouse gas emissions project and other things that are ongoing this year. So to say that no part of that would happen this year probably isn't realistic either, but how much of $25,000 would be spent, could be anywhere from, $500 on some advertising of some surveys to $25,000 of projects wrapped up by January. We don't have to make that commitment now, but council is able to understand that we could do that and that that's within this year's capacity. So I just wanted to kind of how does just the ones that are listed on operating initiatives, just a few things in the budget.
Councillor Carver.
Well, thank you for that. Unless to be misunderstood that I'm against affordable housing, of course I'm not. I'm very much in favor of affordable housing or housing that is affordable, which I prefer to say. And so I feel more comfortable with the explanations and the discussion that it's a flexible pot of money that can be used as deemed most appropriate for the situation.
Okay. Councillor Wilson, you had a comment, I think, in some of your written notes about the cost of identifying the water leakages versus the amount of money to be saved if one were to fix all the water leakages. Did you not?
I don't think so, but I think I might have commented on the fact that we've got $60,000, which I guess on Monday was identified as equipment needed to do the analysis. And then somewhere else in the budget, there's another chunk of money, which I think is the money needed to actually do the analysis. And I wasn't quite sure how that works. Might I just say one thing on housing though, about while I've got my microphone turned on. One of the things about that $30,000 that kind of intrigued me when I was reading it is, I honestly don't know of any of these studies and assessments and et cetera, that have ever resulted in an affordable accommodation being built. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be better from a council's point of view to take that $30,000 and provide $5,000 annual subsidies to people who need the money so they can afford a place to live?
Deputy Mayor?
I hear you, and it's a struggle always in my mind when we spend things like that. But the way I see it is that previously council did not have a strategic plan that talked about affordable housing, and this is how to action that. So my hope is that we will come up with a way that will actually increase affordable housing. If we spend that money and we don't come up with a strategy that actually increases affordable housing, then we'll have failed. So I think for me, this is just setting us up for that success going forward. I know it's a struggle from that perspective in how much that money is, but if we use it wisely, we will set a foundation that will be very impactful. That's my sense of us spending that money.
Okay. Councillor Feeney and then Councillor Now.
So, I think we need to be clear tonight that with what council's opinion is on the proposed rate increase, I support the fire rate increase, and I think it's justifiable, and it's clearly demonstrated why the fire rate increase is required. So that's an easy vote from me. Reading the tea leaves and in having conversations, I don't think if we had to vote this evening on approving the budget rate, the tax rate, I'm not getting a sense that we would get that approved. And I'm not sure, and I'll be honest with you, I want to try to get to a place over the next few meetings where we do better. I think Dylan and Luke have justifiably indicated, based on their professional capacity, but also on their, insight into where all the money goes, why there's pressure on the operating budget. And I think it's easy for us to see, but I just can't get my head around that level of increase given where we are right now, where we're shutting down international travel. We've got 12 or 13% of the workforce of the nation that's under COVID financial support from the federal government. We're closing down restaurants and businesses in a tourism-driven community. We just can't do it. Like, we just can't increase property taxes, in my opinion, by that threshold. So what we need something to get us from here to there, something that's more, short-term in nature. But also, I think we're all realists, and Dylan, you made the point well, and I agree with you. I mean, there's always a day of reckoning. I'm hoping that day of reckoning is moderated by growth, to the deputy mayor's point. And so, personally, I would prefer if we take the pain of the deferral with eyes wide open, knowing that increased costs are going to show up next year, the year after that, or the year after that. But hopefully, when that pain shows up, we have the benefit of higher tax base coming from higher commercial tax base, which is really what we really need right now. I mean, the commercial tax base has declined by, I think, 25% in the last 5 years. So we need that to get back up to help being a bigger contributor to the overall pie. And obviously we have a big ticket investment up the street and more coming down the road. So so it's 8 o'clock, and I think the staff's done a great job of getting us halfway there. I just think we need to give some direction formally to get to the next step. I think a reasonable next step would be something like, you know, a 1.5 cent increase. Like, come back with the view that showed what does a 1.5 cent increase look like, and then give Dylan and Luke some time to say these are all the things that don't get done if it's only 1.5 cents. I can get my head around a 1.5 cent increase, I think.
Okay. Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, I not disagreeing with you, but just putting another proposal on the table is that yes, the fire rate, like you said, the numbers don't lie from that perspective. I think the CEO has sort of pointed out that I'm not putting words in your mouth, but maybe he pointed out that there is a possibility of not changing the numbers, but getting some funds from reserve to sort of absorb that element of a raise. I would be comfortable with the fire rate going up, but not the tax rate in general. And let's find a way to put that in, and then next year we can sort of. My hope is that there will be growth. I sincerely hope that, and I hope that we can also be part of that, engendering that growth during this time, and that will help us mitigate the amount of tax rate we will necessarily have to consider next year. That's where I'm at.
Thank you. Councillor Now, and then Councillor Carver.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the $60,000 that we allocated for water study on the leakages. Just how that gets used, and whether we're really going to see any benefit of spending that $60,000 to try to find out where the leaks are and how much it is going to save you. But you brought it up before, and I think it's worthwhile exploring whether that $60,000 is really going to be a benefit to us.
Thank you. Councillor Carver, and then CAO.
This is a budget 101 question. So last year, our residential tax rate was 1.25, correct? And the recommendation or the suggestion for this year is the combined tax rate of, oh, that was last year. Sorry, I'm on the wrong page.
132.
1.32. But that's a very small increase, isn't it?
It's 5.75%.
5.75%.
Biggest tax
okay.
increase, it's the biggest increase in the history of the town. Other than that, it's pretty small.
So we've been blessed with small
Yeah.
tax increases.
But again, you know, it's
The perfect time to do it when we're in a depression.
CAO, did you, or Councillor Carver, did you get an answer to your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. CAO, you're next, and then Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Councillor Now's question about the $60,000. So, you know, it is generally similar to the housing strategies. The council has in its strategic plan making our water utility more efficient. You know, we've identified an opportunity to reduce losses in the system. Staff have had some discussions with external engineers, CBCL, who we've worked with in the past, trying to define what those options look like. We're not at a time, and again, council strategic plan's been a recent work in progress, recent priority. Council's having some behind the scenes, or staff is having some behind the scenes discussions to support that. But essentially, we're looking at, what do the engineers say we need to do to figure out where those leaks are happening and target them with strategic replacement. And so we've looked at things like flow meters that can be installed at different parts of the system, which was referenced last time. You know, the $60,000 supported by 30,000 external from PCAP, there is some refinement that has to happen to that before we apply to the PCAP program. That PCAP application would I believe would have to be going in within the next month or two. So at a regular meeting of council, we will have a report from our water operator actually recommending whatever we do think that we will be doing in terms of leak detection. But again, this is an operating, in this case, water reserve funded initiative. So, you know, it's drawing on the reserve to the extent that we end up needing to do the work. But in order to enable us to pursue a strategic initiative that is a big part of council's strategic plan, we need to have an understanding that the water utility could afford to do it, and where we might seek external support, you know, from the PCAP program to do that. So to your question, Councillor, now, and we can't say that $60,000 would be money well spent at this point, but like the housing strategy, and I think Deputy Mayor said this well, is, you know, if we decide to spend it, and if we do spend it, then we better make sure it's money well spent. So it's not something we go into lightly, and we just haven't had time to really bring a report to council. Like I think you've all had an opportunity to get to know our water operator, but she's not the kind of person who's going to put recommendations in front of a council that we don't feel we can stand behind. And at this point, you know, we don't have that. We have a number that is based on a reasonable estimate of what the scope of that project might be, that demonstrates that the water reserve can accommodate it. So that's the answer that I can provide. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Councillor Feeney, are you just waving to somebody, or?
Sure, I'll just, you know, I'm always happy to talk at budget time. Just have to cut me off where they have the little, the floor that opens up, you fall down into the pool with the sharks down below.
Mm-hmm.
So feel free to pull the plug.
It's going to be on the next change order for the town hall.
So just a couple of odds and ends. So somewhere between, you know, the deputy mayor's proposal to have staff come back with a 0 rate increase and a modestly higher one, saying 2 cents is the right answer. So I think we need to get to that point sometime in the next 45 minutes or so. And then a couple other little things, like, so I'm a little reticent to, given our conservative nature, to bank on the construction dividend associated with the solar garden until we have a little more visibility on that, unless staff can provide, you know, kind of a more informed opinion that no, we're okay, and we should keep that in there. If we can keep it in there, terrific. But if the staff really, in hindsight, thinks, you know what, maybe we ought to moderate that or pull that and make have a more conservative estimate on the timing around that, like, I'd be okay with that too, given that we are making almost a $500,000 contribution to the capital reserve, aren't we, Luke? I think it's on one of your pages there. Don't have it right in front of me which page that is. Luke, can you remember what page that is?
Looking it up now.
So the point is, even if we don't get the area dividend, we still are going to be net contributing to the capital reserve, I think. That's
right now we're looking at $550,000 going to the capital reserve.
Right. Conversely, like, we're taking, I would say, a more aggressive stance on the receipt of those funds. Hope springs eternal, but it is already May, and the year flies by, and construction period has got a window, blah, blah, blah. So you got the point on that. Second thing is, I think our deed transfer tax, like, I did a quick kind of review today. Like, I think we've had, since April 1st, we've had $4.8 million of real estate transactions that are either sold or pending, to Councillor Wilson's point. So I think we're well on our way to hitting 120, and hey, it's not an endless pool of funds, but we may do a little bit. We may want to revisit that one estimate as well. It seems a little low relative to what we've seen in the last 3 weeks as far as deals getting closed. I think those are. I think that's it, Mayor, for me for a few minutes at least.
Councillor Burdick.
Yeah, so that was one of the things that I was going to bring up with was a deed transfer tax, and it was very conservative in my opinion. I understand that desire, but I do think I don't think the housing market is going to remain insanely at this level throughout the whole year, but it could. It's going to for several months, I think, at the rate we're going. So I think it would be worth discussing increasing that amount a little bit. And despite my previous concerns and remarks that I had, I do think it is worth revisiting the taxes and just seeing if there is some wiggle room there in terms of lowering them. I'm not an anti-tax person in light of knowing that years accrue and there could be many surprises anyway. But I do think that, it is fair to look at where we can go down in some of those numbers there. But yeah, I think it is really a good idea to start. I have a feeling that it is a long process and to be able to get a sense of where everybody is on the taxes would be great.
Okay, thank you. CAO?
I just wanted to speak to the dividend for solar and the deed transfer. So the dividend for solar, I think that is fairly similar to what we discussed with regards to showing the Riverport stuff in there. Like they're things that we anticipate, but they're not things that are an absolute. And while it's good to have a big picture of what could happen in the year, and that's what staff set out to provide, it is important that we know what will happen, what could happen, and be able to understand some of the differences there. So that dividend absolutely will not materialize if we don't have the capital project going ahead. Like there's very, very contingent. Now, what it does do by having it in there, or what it does by taking it out, is it changes the resulting capital reserve balance at the end of the year. And that's really all that it does. So where we know the capital reserve balance is more than sufficient to accommodate any current year projects, we're not counting on it. It's just going in there, and could just as easily can be removed in the next draft, kind of similarly to what we're doing by removing the flow through around Riverport expenses. So those are the kind of things that, it's just context. It provides context, and it may be simpler to remove that. The deed transfer tax increase, and talking about being conservative around that, and ultimately that also, because we're putting it through the capital, if we increase the deed transfer tax projected for the current year, what it does is it increases the end of year resulting capital reserve balance, and that helps council to see how we could afford the projects that we have in mind, which I think the budget shows that we can afford. So if we have a windfall on deed transfer tax, that's where it ends up. The one is where that's relevant to talking about the current year, and especially our discussion about deferring possible tax increases, maybe using the operating reserve as we did last year, and then maybe like last year, actually managing to tighten our belts and not needing to dip into that reserve, is around that practice that is in this budget of taking $150,000 out of the money that would go towards capital funding and using it to, essentially top up that operating reserve. And, if we're looking at, can we afford to top up that operating reserve this year? And I think that the draft budget demonstrates that that can be afforded and still leave solid balances at the capital side of things. You could feel better about doing that if you had an expectation that the deed transfer tax was actually going to come in significantly higher. What that means when you're talking about, should we take this year and take a planned transfer from reserve to defer an anticipated tax rate, and how safe is it to assume that we can afford to do that? Well, if you think that the operating reserve will be buoyed by things like additional revenue from new development that's happening, that gives you reason to believe that at the end of this year, we likely won't end up having to go through with that operating reserve transfer, as we did not do last year. And so it's just a question of whether you reflect it in the document or don't reflect it in the document. It will still have the same effect at the end of the day. And that's one of the reasons I think budgeting to cover a deferred rate increase from a operating reserve transfer is a reasonable thing to do. And you can kind of draw the line from deferred tax rate, operating reserve balance, from capital stream and deed transfer tax. And you can say, well, if the deed transfer tax comes in great for this year, we were actually right to defer the tax increase because we didn't necessarily need a tax increase in this year. But that would be something we wouldn't be gambling on by dividing it that way in the budget.
Any other comments? Councillor Feeney.
So, I mean, we're very fortunate to be where we are. And, you know, a number of councils over a number of terms made tough decisions. There's people around the table that recall how contentious the original infrastructure fee was. But yet, you know, we all now can see why not only is it a productive tax as far as generating revenue, but it's a fair tax. Everybody pays. It's spread out equally over all the people, all of the citizens who need our infrastructure and our utility customers. And I think this is the wrong time to touch that infrastructure fee. So I believe it's, Luke, your plan is to keep it at 195. Pardon me, 295, which has been in place
correct.
it's been in place that rate for a couple of years. And I think I think that's a good decision. And I guess we're also fortunate that we've got these other streams of revenue. Mahone Bay, as you all know, is the first town in the province to implement the D-transfer tax. Everybody's followed our suit in that front. We're now at one, and we were at 1 3 years or 4 years ago. We're at 1.5 now, and now we're reaping, you know, solid yields on that for another fair tax. People pay it because they want to pay it, not because they have to pay it. If they want to live in town, cost of doing business. So, unfortunately, all those things and the federal government support with the gas tax, and of course, all the investments that the taxpayers support from area, that's what's making the merry-go-round go round with regard to our capital investments. And I have every confidence that positive trend is going to continue. On the operating side, however, I do think we just need to be cognizant that we have one of the highest tax loads in the province. And we can talk a lot about our average assessment rate and is it the average house cost, but the reality is, regardless of how much houses cost, it's all about affordability. And we have a household income here where 5.5% of everybody's household income is going to pay property taxes on average, according to according to the municipal report that we received last October. So I don't personally see a lot of capacity for people to afford a lot higher property taxes unless we magically find out that everybody who's moved here in the last 6 months is a heck of a lot richer than the people who already live here now. And maybe that will bear out, maybe that'll be true, but when it comes to household income, which in Mahone Bay was $57,000 last year, like, you can't get blood from a stone. There's only so much cash people have to pay property taxes. And I think we're absolutely at the limit. And I think the report that we received from the province told us that. Like, so when I hear the kind of the double talk of saying, well, we got to increase our operating reserve, but you can't really do much because your tax load is the highest in Nova Scotia. Like, it's, thank you for the observation, provincial government. But I mean, we can't do everything. We can't meet the 50% of operating cost operating reserve, which is $1 million, huge amount of money, and still be able to moderate the tax load. So I think we're doing our best, but it's a hard lift. It's really tough.
CL.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of the way that those financial condition indicators work. Striving to have all green indicators in most cases is not going to be doing the best job for the residents. And there are places where council has to make some difficult decisions. I just wanted to note specific to those calculations, how they are done behind the scenes, because essentially what we're doing every year for the last 5 years is we're comparing our current taxes against 2016 census data around income levels. So it is worth noting that from the perspective of the province, while our costs grow every year, residents' ability to pay has not changed since 2016. And I do think that we are in this next census in for a significant change in that regard. I think residents' ability to pay has changed since 2016. I'm not going to venture to say how much, but I'm very interested to see how much that does reset the residential tax burden indicator by at least a few points after it catches up for 5 years of missing data. So it should be noted that it's always going to look, the residential tax burden is always going to look heaviest, at least in a growing economy, in the year before a new census is released. So that is part of what we're seeing with that indicator.
Interesting. Deputy Mayor.
This has nothing to do with the budget, has everything to do with the time we are planning to finish this off. I mean, in as much as I love talking numbers, I'm hoping that we can finish off by 9, because past 9, my thinking capacity with numbers will be done.
Good idea. CAO, can we break this in? Can we get a motion now on the fire rate and set that aside and continue to talk about the tax rate?
Yeah, I can. So my suggestion in terms of what I've heard around the table, and again, this is just a suggestion from what I've heard about ways to move forward. You know, we have some revisions that have been discussed in terms of the Riverport flow through, in terms of the dividend for solar. Those are revisions that don't change the actual document. We're not removing any items. We're just changing how we're portraying projections for the year. Other than that, we've talked about items is generally focused around this question of the, you know, revenue to fund the operating is going to come from either revenue from taxes or another source, or those expenditures are going to be reduced. And as I've said, you know, what I favor council doing is directing staff to provide a budget draft that shows a deferral of a certain amount of taxes, which we would actually defer with an operating reserve transfer in the current year budget. And then in practice, you know, as we did with last year, do our best to actually mitigate that. And we did mitigate that last year. So if that was the case, the motion that council would need to make is just that the revised draft of the 2021-22 budget defer X amount of the projected or proposed tax increase. And then we would show that as a reserve transfer. Or if Luke and I, in looking for that opportunity for reserve transfer, see some things that we really feel could have been a little bit lower and that reserve transfer might not correspond to the full amount, you know, we can certainly look at that. But again, I don't think I would just go through and look at special 2021-22 cost savings as a result of the pandemic to justify the deferral. I think it would be advisable to defer it with an operating reserve transfer. So there's a motion there to revise the next version of the budget that I think we should get tonight to get past that point. I don't think we need a motion to keep the fire rate the way it is, because it would continue to be the way it is unless otherwise referenced. So that would be my suggestion in terms of a motion to move forward. And then I think we reserve the discussion around the utilities to a subsequent special meeting. Obviously, in the interest of time, we had a good discussion around general tax rate tonight. We can keep the discussion around the electrical utility for the next session, and then move into closed session and have a couple of opportunity to talk about a couple items before 9.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Now.
Yeah, just in realizing with the fire tax rate, I have a problem with the honorarium going up by 50%. We got a $7,500 increase in there, and it says about an increase in honorarium to the fire chief. Well, the fire chief never got a separate honorarium before, and I think as a volunteer, I'm not sure that we surely should be getting into that. So I think it's something that we need to get delve into a little further. I'm not sure about the superintendent part, if that's to regarding looking after the new fire hall when it gets done. That's only going to start in January, and I think that would be more an employee thing than an honorarium thing.
Is the superintendent like a custodian?
There's been a number of different services that are performed in other departments that we've looked at. I think vehicle maintenance does come into that as well in town of Lunenburg, is my understanding. But again, this is one of those areas where before we would establish a position of a superintendent, there would be a recommendation to council to try to lay out what that would consist of. And like we mentioned last time, we're not 100% right now on, would it be a position? Would it be a collection of duties that could be performed by members? Would it be an external service contract, or would it be overlaid on top of other service contracts? I think we could absolutely just change the $7,500 line to reference the intended purpose, which is to provide somewhere to allocate costs associated with professionally undertaking the maintenance of our fire assets, whether that be building or vehicles. So there's an understanding that there's a need for additional costs there. How we want to reference that, obviously that's discretionary. Point well taken, Councillor. Now that the council may feel that the right way to do it is to build these costs into, service contracts, go to RFP, not attach additional responsibilities to the members of the department. Those are discussions the council would still need to have. So I think maybe in the next version, we just continue to work on nuancing that heading that Luke had already changed the heading of. Maybe we change that $7,500 heading to reference, what we're talking about achieving with the cost, not how we do it.
Okay, Councillor Feeney.
Mayor, just for
And then
clarification,
Councillor Wilson.
just for clarification, so what we would be making a motion this evening to direct staff to come back to council with a third iteration of the budget under the impression that the fire rate will be as proposed at 1.65. The
1.167, isn't it?
pardon me, is what as proposed, as submitted now.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
the direct rate would be flat, with the gap between flat and the proposal to be funded through a withdrawal from the operating reserve. And just that version would be that. I think that Dylan, that's what you're saying, isn't it? That 4 cents. So 3 cents, 7.2 cents overall, 3 cents is coming from fire, and the 4 cents you're proposing would come out of the operating reserve, at least as you illustrated in the next iteration. Is that what you're proposing?
Yeah, that was essentially what I'm proposing. I think you can decide in the motion how much of that you want to see covered in that way. You could still leave, you could decide. But if council were to vote on that, then we would bring that forward. And we would look for opportunities to, obviously reduce that transfer from reserve. But I think rather than just looking for opportunities to make it disappear magically, I think my recommendation would be, at least for the next version, that we show the corresponding transfer. And then maybe, if council has some ideas about ongoing costs, not one-time operating costs, but ongoing costs that we want to explore savings, we certainly can, and we're happy to do that. Luke and I are always looking for those when there are ideas. So yes, that's what we were thinking of tonight.
Okay. Councillor Wilson.
I'm just trying to get clear myself. So what you're really recommending is no revision to the budget at all, just a revision to how it's paid for. So in other words, instead of taking the tax money directly from the taxpayer, we'll take it out of the reserve fund that came from the taxpayer last year.
Yeah, that's the proposal. That's right.
Well,
which in practice last year was a result of actually managing to work within our budget and not dip into the operating reserve.
But it still leaves us with the potential of the full list of items that is on the current version of the budget.
Like I'd prefer to see a version that comes back with an attempt at some more economies first, but either way, I think we end up in a similar place based on based on where the CAO is coming from, on just saying, well, this is the best view from staff. And remember, council has approved some things that are incremental, like the GHG position. I mean, that came to council, we reviewed it, we approved it. I mean, that's an incremental FTE that needs to get funded. So it doesn't get funded, like somehow it's got to get funded. So there are pressures on the operating budget for sure. I just think we're just looking for something we can get our heads around to make sure we're given somebody has to be an advocate for the taxpayer. I think that's what we're all the 7 of us are trying to do this evening.
Councillor Wilson?
I think I'm prepared to move a motion which does not reflect the CAO's wishes, but and it doesn't reflect mine, but it gets a little bit close. I'd like to move that council instruct staff to revise the 21-22 operating budget to reflect a 1.5 cent increase in the residential tax rate.
Okay, do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Feeney.
Just for clarity, is that on the fire rate or in encompassing the fire rate, or Councillor Wilson, and you meant that to just leave that to staff to determine in the next draft?
No, I'm sorry. I thought the residential tax rate was as it's outlined in the budget. So this,
Well, I just wanted to make sure.
I
the fire rate is
Okay.
fire rate is different now. Is that correct?
Yes.
I just
okay.
wanted
Well,
to
I
make
meant-
sure that that was your intention.
Yes, that's my sense. Sorry.
So if I could pursue that, Councillor Wilson, in the information that we had received showed the proposed tax rate residential at 1.157,
Mm-hmm.
and we had a proposed fire rate of 0.167 and a combined rate residential of 1.324. And Councillor Wilson's motion would take it down to 1.309, I guess. Bring it down by 1.5
1.3.
cents. Luke, what's the number? Have I miscalculated? 1.324 minus 1.5 cents. Here we go.
1.309.
1.30.
That's it, 1.309. That is your intent, Mr. Wilson? Okay. So moved and seconded. I'm sorry, Councillor Now?
Yeah, so does that, I'm just trying to get the motion straight. Did he say he wanted a 1.5 increase or a 1.5% decrease from what was proposed?
So 1.5 cent,
Cents.
not percent.
No, 1.5 cents over what we had last year, you mean?
Correct.
That's a
On the
good
residential rate only.
Yes. So in other words, we'll have about a 5 cent increase with fire tax or anything.
4.5. 4.5. Right? 4.5 cents? We're
Increase
increasing
total,
4.5 increase total.
yes. Deputy Mayor,
That's a big number.
Yes, my maybe question to Councillor Wilson is, what's the benefit of the small increase? Because I'm thinking about it from a material benefit to the overall budget, vis-a-vis just adding when I look at benefit vis-a-vis burden to an individual, I see that from my perspective, it doesn't add that much benefit to our budget, but might have significant, I guess, burden to somebody in the community. And so if we can absorb it within this year, I'm struggling with why we would want to do that anyways, when it doesn't give us that material gain in the budget process.
Your Worship, I'm not sure I understand. Are you suggesting we leave it at the full amount? Or are you suggesting we take it to zero?
My suggestion was take it to zero.
the change, the delta would go to zero.
Yeah.
As in no increase in the
Yeah,
that
yeah.
rate, yeah.
That, Your Worship, was my going in position, and I'd be happy to make a friendly amendment to my own motion in that regard.
And the amendment would be to limit the increment to zero.
To limit the residential increase to zero.
Councillor Feeney, you seconded that?
So I think I will second that, and then we maybe have a brief discussion if you don't mind.
Okay,
So like I'm with you spiritually. Like, so to the deputy mayor's point, like what's the virtue of the 1.5 cents? We're talking $21,000 of increased revenue for expenses. So in the context of $21,000 of operating expense, given our large operating surplus last year, which albeit was thrust upon us due to circumstance versus solid planning, I think I think it can be justified. It's not going to, but I do think that cumulatively at some point down the road, that 1.5 cents is going to show back up somewhere down the road. But I mean, sure, I'm okay with 3 cents on fire rate and no increase on operating, but the gap's going to come out of the operating surplus. I think that's what Dylan's talking about here.
yeah.
Fair enough.
Councillor Carver, you had your hand up.
Yes, thank you. So I just want to clarify the motion. Is this to direct staff to prepare draft version 3 using that figure? We're not approving it forever and final. No,
Correct.
so it's just to prepare a new draft using that figure. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? Councillor Wilson?
But just to be crystal clear, my motion says to revise the budget, not to simply take the money out of the operating surpluses from other years. So this is requesting staff to go and look at the budget and come up with whatever the savings are that are necessary to offset the lack of an increase in residential rate.
Residential tax rate. Okay. CAO?
Yeah, I think Councillor Feeney just pointed out that simply won't be possible. So this motion can pass and staff can come back and tell you how much that number is, and we can present it however which way you want. I'm not going to present it as magical savings. So if we want to show a bunch of numbers are reduced for 2020, 21, 22 because of COVID, there reasonably are some areas where we can anticipate savings. We can put a note in the budget that says these are reduced for this year, but likely will be back up by the same amount in the following year. I'd prefer to do that with a reserve transfer. We'll present that for council's consideration at the next meeting, and council can continue to look at, how do you square that circle in terms of the narrative, which I think is really what you're talking about at this point, is that narrative that you're trying to present, the difference between an honest deferral and a narrative that we're just going to have a different kind of year. We are going to have a different kind of year, but Councillor Feeney's right that we're eventually going to have a normal kind of year too.
Yeah, I might suggest that the footnote would read that the reduction in the residential tax rate is for fiscal year 21-22, and council may choose to reinstate or to put the tax rate back up in subsequent years. Right? Okay. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Alice, is that a question? Okay.
Question. Could I get the motion rephrased? And because it's been talked about a little bit, I want to hear exactly what the numbers are that are being suggested.
You want it read back to you?
I do. Yes, please.
Okay. Who's got the motion? CAO? Or Mr. Wilson?
So neither of us have that motion.
I have it.
Okay.
I don't have the raw numbers. I only have the number of the amount of increase, which is
The
0.
change, yes.
So the motion reads that council instructs staff to revise the 21-22 operating budget to reflect a 0 cent increase in the residential tax rate.
Okay.
So in other words, no change.
So the tax rate is as presented, or the fire rate rather, it's the tax rate that will not change. Councillor Carver.
Yes, I just need to clarify with the CAO what I think I heard him say. in response to this motion, or the idea of this motion, which that it would be sort of a futile exercise. Is that, did I get that wrong?
No, I mean, the motion's absolutely fine, and staff will definitely come back and present, as we're being asked, a version of the 21-22 operating budget that's reflective of a 0% increase in tax rate. The only question has been how that happens. Like right off the bat, the 0% increase in tax rate is easy to show. If we show it by showing a transfer from operating to cover it, that's achieving that result.
Right.
The alternative is to go through and look at a bunch of expenditures where we've said it will be 8 and say, well, actually it'll be 7. This one says it'll be 10, and we'll get by with 9, and come up with $50,000 or whatever the number is that way. What we'll do in this case is, because we're looking at drafts, we'll present that for council, and council at your next meeting can hopefully decide what is the narrative you want to tell to the public. Is it better suited to show the deferral, or better suited to show those reductions? And in the course of looking for those reductions, we may very well feel that some of the numbers honestly should be revised down, and that doesn't represent an aberration in just this year. But that's been my contention, is that there certainly are numbers that can come down because COVID will result in a different kind of year, just like it did last year. But I think that the narrative is, we understand it to be a one-time thing, and we should be honest with residents that that's what it represents.
Right. Well, it feels a little bit like smoke and mirrors to me at the moment, but I think I'd be prepared to support the motion, just because it's an exercise, and we get to see a different picture coming back.
And we will see a version 3 of the budget with the effort of staff to reduce the cost to get us to that 0 increase tax rate. Any other questions or comments on the motion? All in favor? Motion's carried. So we'll wait with bated breath for version 3.
Mayor, just before we go into in camera, I do think that I have a number of questions around the budget submission regarding the electrical utility, and I'm hoping, to the CAO's point, we'll have an opportunity to kind of have enough work time to talk about those things, and specifically some of the Riverport assumptions and things like that. So I know we didn't have a chance to talk about it this evening, but sometime between now and late May, I think, to Councilor Burdick's point, when I'm assuming we're not going to be able to ratify the budget the first week of May, given the calendar dates and how busy next week is. But is it our intention to try to move the ratification of the budget to the second council meeting in May? Personally, I think that's a good idea.
I think that's the prudent.
Everybody seems comfortable. And so we have the
Direction.
strategic plan hearing on the 10th, and the strategic plan going to council on the 11th. And the strategic plan is really baked into the budget. So very appropriate next meeting thereafter, we have a budget going to council, and that gives us time for a couple of additional special meetings. As you say, Councillor Feeney, we may not have any next week. There may be an opportunity if MJSB is canceled. And
It is.
I was thinking it may be, yeah, David, thank you. I hadn't heard from Jennifer for sure. So at the end of this meeting tonight, or right now, if we're about to go into closed session, we could talk about the possibility of next Wednesday. I imagine Luke and I will have, Luke, you're shaking your head. Do you have a conflict, Luke?
I do have an unavoidable conflict that night, yes.
Well, thank you. I was going to say, I'm sure it wouldn't be hard for us to send out a budget in between, but I think what we'll have to do then is send out a budget next week in preparation for having that next session the following week, and we can get that figured out.
Okay. Okay. Councillor Feeney.
Mayor, I'd move that we move to closed session if you're prepared to hear that motion.
I am indeed.
Any questions from the, after the,
But it's technically not part of the agenda on a special meeting. And so I know last time
Okay.
around,
No.
David
The
didn't
mayor
ask for
had said so,
questions. We
so-
don't, yeah.
It's just under they take the time to listen. I think we should take the time to see if they have any questions, but we have a motion on the floor. Counselor Wilson? He votes all in favor of the motion to go in camera? Done. Are there any?
I didn't catch the mover and seconder. I'm very sorry about that. Can we just get a mover and seconder again?
Mover was Counselor Feeney, seconder was Counselor Wilson, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
And are there any citizens watching?
There are 6 people watching right now, and but there are no questions.
Okay, that's good. We must have answered all the questions in the process. Well, thank you, citizens, for joining us.